Yeah, no pressure on this panel or anything, is there? There's a whole workshop thinking about changing the world, and then this is the question, this is a point. We've got to come up with some answers here, people. But we have a fabulous panel to do that with, and this will work with a similar structure to the one that Ollie chaired on Monday. So every panellist will express some of the bees in their bonnets for 5 minutes each, and then we will have a discussion between us here on the floor, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. And we started a little late, so we'll run a tiny bit over the scheduled time, but there's going to be lots to discuss, so that'll all be fine. Before we get started, I want to get my oar in too, and I wanted to pose some questions, and these are not necessarily related to the things that the panellists are going to talk about, but I have picked up over the past few days some things that I think the people in this room need to answer. And I wrote them down yesterday, so I'm very glad some of them came up this morning. So in the context of how we create change, here are some things I think we need to think about. How do we prevent whatever comes out of this being just the educated Western white middle classes telling everyone what to do again, right? We need to move past that. So that's the first thing. How do we make this, whatever happens, how does that genuinely include? And include doesn't just mean have them in the room so they can be told what to do. What do we actually want to come out of this? That's a hard question. It's very evident over the past 3 days that lots of people in the room have different ideas about that. And some of them are complementary and maybe some of them aren't, but that's something to think about. What are the risks and benefits of this idea, Gaia 2.0? What are the risks of it becoming either politicized or, as we heard this morning, sacred? What if either of those two things happens? What problems is that going to cause? What is this about? And to sort of feed into that, is this about practical outcomes or is this about worldviews? Do you create change? Do you want to create change by making people do things, or do you care about why they do those things? And it's assumed that they come along together. But if you had to choose between someone having your worldview and doing the thing you thought was best for the world, which one would you pick? Because you may have to choose. We may have to choose. And the other one is that, this is something I haven't heard any discussion of, is that in any system change, and there have been some big ideas about big system transformational changes, in any system change, there are winners, and it sounds from the discussion we've heard that especially a lot of the poorest people in society would potentially be winners out of the system, but there will also be losers because it's a system change and that's how systems work. And unless you acknowledge that up front and start thinking about that, I think there's a lot of problems stored up. So those are my sort of thoughts for, in the context of creating change, I think those are things that can't be ignored. So having stuck my oar in very rudely, I am now going to invite our fabulous panellists who all have very different perspectives and very different bees in their bonnets to share those bees. So we have Jane Fisher, Harry Studholme, Kirsty Lewis, David Schwartzman, and John Elkington, and they'll say a little bit more each about where they're coming from. But we're going to start with Jane, down the end, from the Centre for Alternative Technology. Tell us about the bees in your bonnet.
Okay, hello everybody. So my name's Jane, and I come from a background of environmental science. I was a physical geographer originally, became a freshwater ecologist. I worked for NERC and traditional universities. And then I followed the bees in my bonnet, as it were, and I moved to the Centre for Alternative Technology because I felt that teaching sustainability was the most important thing that I could do. So I'm going to shed some of my thoughts on you today. And that one of those is that sustainability teaching for far too long has focused on sort of what you can do around the home. It's been small scale, it's been recycling, turning off the lights. It's not been about biogeochemical cycles and the roles that we all have within the natural ecosystems. Partly because of that and partly because we are a Western culture, we're all very separate from understanding our role within natural biogeochemical global systems. So what can we do to make positive change? That's the question that we've been asked to consider today. I think one's quite a practical one. So one is that we fail to mediate and to look after our landscape in any sort of mindful way. When I say mindful, I mean informed, I mean scientific. If we take the UK as an example, in order to become sustainable, in order to meet zero carbon, we have to feed ourselves, provide timber for building, we have to fuel ourselves, and we have to do it without just nicking the resources from other nations. To do that, we need landscape-wide national policy. We need to change our education for sustainability. You know, we don't talk enough about it in schools. If we do, it is very segregated. When we talk about it at universities, it sits in a single module. It needs to be embedded. We need to encourage complex thinking. We need to overhaul education from being this competitive thing to, you know, enabling competitive cooperative working for people to work with each other and to learn from each other. But I think one of the biggest changes we all need to make in this room is, as academics and scientists, is we can talk about transformational change, but most of us are not doing it. Most of us are business as usual. And for most of us, for the last few decades, we've probably all been writing papers and talking at conferences like this one. And we all know we talk to ourselves. And some of us are writing blogs and using social media and are very creative with it. But at the end of the day, it's still making tiny, tiny, slow changes. And those changes are not fast enough. So last week, a lot of you would have seen on the BBC an article saying, we don't have till 2030, we have 18 months to change the legislation, the finance, the governance of nations so we can meet these climate change targets. 18 months. That's not going to happen in the speed of getting papers published. And also, you know, most of these papers, they don't make these big global scale changes that we're talking about today. So we need to look within ourselves and say, as scientists, what else do we do? How many of us have stood for local or national parliament? How many of us have spoken on TV? How many of us have gone into a local national planning policy meeting when there's been a large, you know, development going on and given evidence, argued for or against? That's where the changes happen. There are incremental slow ones, but the big transformative changes that will push a state from one to another within societies will most likely be top down from governments. And I think we need to be more vocal as scientists and work towards that. That is my bees gone. Thank you.
That's Jane. So, more activism from you lot. Harry, what do you think?
Lots of things. To introduce myself, really, I started off as an engineer and found it too interesting and became an accountant. And then, through a series of accidents running factories and things, ended up in Devon because my parents died running a farm. And so, and part of this, I'm part of the sort of done to, the apparently unmindful manager of land as a forester and as a farmer, a card-carrying member of the NFU. And from that, through bad management, I ended up chairing the Southwest Regional Development Agency, which was very involved and looking at how one drove environmental change at a government level. And the sort of the ultimate demonstration of the difficulty of managing relationships with government is we were, I found the last year and a half of my chairmanship winding up the organisation. And from then I went into being the chairman of the State Forests, the Forestry Commission. And once again, however much one tries to do good within government, my principal job really was tidying up the pieces after the government tried to sell us off, and then trying to separate between Scotland and England the role of forestry and managing the relationship with government ministers. So what are my points, really? I think so many good points have been made, and I think one of the challenges really is to not keep lobbying new ideas into the system, but it is to capture what is good and true and to work with that. And I really appreciated Susan's talk about the elephants, the working with people on the ground to make them feel empowered and to make them feel part of the system. The risk that Helen was talking about really is of, you know, as a farmer and a forester, I'm very aware of the being done to, the feeling that people are telling you that you are wrong, which is very disempowering. And also the language is challenging. I was very struck too by James's comments about the danger of not taking action. I felt very deeply, it was a sort of blow through the heart, really. I've been trying to persuade landowners since 1988, at least, when I was president of the Country Landowners Association in Devon. And I can remember an impassioned speech trying to get them to take climate change and sea level rise seriously, and met with a sort of deathly silence. So I'm very, very concerned about those arguments which say we should not do something because it might put off people from responding to mitigation. Slow change is really important, particularly because we tend to be talking about these sort of giant effects. With the Forestry Commission, the things that I notice most are the marginal effects, the effects that occur from a very small change in temperature. So at the moment, one of the biggest impacts on the landscape may well come from a move between, say, an average temperature in a summer of half a degree, which is the difference between a beetle flying and not flying. The difference between a beetle that could transmit a disease from one tree to another and not transmitting it. And in the Czech Republic, the impact on the Ipstipographus beetle that's been able to breed 3 times this year already and destroy vast areas of forests as a consequence of a small movement in temperature, or indeed the mountain pine beetle affecting California. So these marginal changes are important, and we should not be sitting back and thinking, oh crumbs, it's further away. It's here, it's now. The other point I wanted to make is the importance of emergent thinking. It's not simply these big ideas. I actually revel in lots and lots of people coming up with lots of different small ideas. I mean, it's not just in the mathematics that we're now able to use in modeling scenarios, slightly different scenarios to find out what works best. It's at a human scale, it's at an evolutionary scale, we've always done it. So we should revel in the slightly different solutions. And so part of that is the importance, and this seems a terrible thing to say, of not worrying about the imprecision of language, because it is the very imprecision of language, the very fact that we all understand something slightly different when we use the word Gaia or the environment, that allows us all to work together. If we were all listening to each other's brains, working out what precisely was understood by each of those words, we would end up with a sort of cacophony of disagreement. We need to all work together with our slightly different understandings, but recognizing that we have a common goal to achieve.
Thank you very much, Harry. For a different opinion again, we've got Kirsty from the Met Office.
Hi, yes. So I guess from my perspective, I work at the Met Office and now newly part-time as well at the Global Systems Institute. And I work within the Met Office in our applied climate area. So my perspective is very much about how we translate some of our climate science knowledge and integrating it really with other disciplines to understand long-term human well-being and human security. I think what I found in the conference so far is we have talked a lot about Gaia 2.0 being about bringing consciousness to Gaia, and in the sense that we can use our collective intelligence to help sort of manage Gaia processes. But I think we haven't talked quite so much about the fact that consciousness also brings values with it. And maybe it's sort of implicit, really, but there are things that we care about. We've talked a bit about how we shouldn't just be seeing Gaia as a resource for our own purposes. But on the other hand, I think we have to recognize the fact that we are conscious, we understand the suffering, and we understand suffering of others, and we care about other people. And so I think there's something else in there about that our objectives maybe are slightly different, that we do have a purpose in a way that Gaia maybe doesn't. And so I think it's important that we use our scientific knowledge to help understand what the scale of the challenges that we face are. So as I say, I work in this kind of translation of the climate science and trying to think about it in a more kind of holistic systems context. So for example, in my team, we would look at food security, thinking all the way through to how people meet their food needs to live fulfilled lives, not just thinking about modelling crop growth under different climate change scenarios. So I think it's about understanding the risks of these climatic changes to humankind and the kind of decisions and system changes we can make to minimize these risks, not just to survive, because I think Gaia will mean that life will survive, but really to thrive in our future world. So some of the work I do is maybe about comparing what a 2 degree of warming means compared to 4 degree of warming, to make it the case really for the level of effort we should be applying to mitigating climate change, to cutting our greenhouse gas emissions. But actually, there's also quite a lot of work in terms of just describing the amount of effort we should be putting in, we should be investing in coping with the changes that we've already committed to or that we are about to commit to. So climate change has the potential to cause a huge amount of harm and suffering, and that's a big part of what we care about. But I think a lot of this is also about the human systems which the future climate will act on. So I feel hopeful maybe that at the moment we're starting to see an increase in understanding of the scale of the challenge associated with addressing the causes of climate change, but I feel less sure that really this is being well translated into the transformational changes we need in the way we operate just to survive. So not just, as I say, contributing, not just living in climate change, but thriving in a future climate. So I can give an example of some work. Recently, I've been looking quite a lot at Ethiopia and looking at food security in Ethiopia. And one of the things I looked at was the relationship between drought events in Ethiopia and acute food insecurity events. And there's a general narrative that drought causes food insecurity. In the future, there'll be more frequent and severe droughts and therefore more food insecurity. But actually, when I looked at it, of course, droughts do cause crop loss locally in particular, and that leads to food insecurity. But in the heterogeneous nature of the climate in Ethiopia means that actually these are quite localized events. And what you don't see is a relationship between these drought or these food insecurity events and total production within the country. So some area will have a really good year, another will have a poor year. But the food system is such that you're looking at smallholder farmers. When it doesn't rain on their crop, subsistence farmers, they lose their food, but they also lose their income. So they lose access to the market. There's food there, but they can't get it. So in a way, we see the relationship between the climate and the food security is more complex. And what we've seen in recent years is that the numbers of people dying in Ethiopia as a result of acute food insecurity events has fallen away to almost nothing in the last few decades. But at the same time, the frequency of these events and the numbers of people affected hasn't really changed at all. If anything, it's getting a bit larger. And so in one way, it's a triumph that these people aren't dying anymore of food insecurity events, but in another way, it's a tragedy that actually we haven't actually solved the problem of food insecurity, which is a sort of systems problem rather than a climatological one. So I think what this says is that we need to understand, in terms of adapting to our future climate, we need to think transformationally. It's not just incrementally. We've got much better at providing early warning of disasters. We've got much better at providing humanitarian assistance, but we haven't actually seen or been able to implement transformational change such that the system is not so vulnerable to a future climate. I think Chris Rapley mentioned yesterday about the idea that human mind is not, Jay Forrester's idea that the human mind is not adapted to interpreting how social systems behave. And I think I agree with this, but we have to find ways to make decisions to try to adapt in these complex systems nevertheless. So I want to make just a couple of points about maybe how we can do that. And I guess I'm coming from the climate science perspective. So I think one of the things we need to do as climate scientists is to move away, well, all of us actually, to move away from thinking of climate science as being predictive and being a broadcast activity. So traditionally, we run our Earth system models, we make climate projections and a range of greenhouse gas emission scenarios, and we broadcast them out, and we tell people about climate change, and then maybe social scientists, economists, security analysts will look at those projections and derive a so what in this kind of linear way. And we might think, as climate scientists, of these being projections about sampling the future probability space of climate, but actually I think they're received as predictions with very large uncertainty on them, and so that climate scientists don't really know what's going to happen. And then that kind of leads, we get calls for, no, we need more data, we need to reduce uncertainty, you need to be more specific. And I'm not sure that that's really the solution, that just putting out more and more specific data about a future, as if we can make predictions about what the future climate or future impacts will be, is useful. And how do you act on that information? So I think instead we need to think from a research perspective about thinking in a more truly transdisciplinary way. So following those climate change impacts all the way through the outcomes we care about, thinking about how they occur within the systems and what the system changes are that we can change the outcomes to where we want them to be. and really just exploring systems behaviours rather than predicting alternative futures that we can choose.
Briefly, you've sort of...
One last
one
final
more,
point.
okay.
Yeah, okay. So that was just that. I think we also, along with that, we shouldn't just be talking about the problems. I think we should be describing the outcomes that we're looking at. So that kind of comes back to the fact that we're applying some values, and we have them in the 2-degree Paris target, but I think we also have them for human being, well-being and security in the Sustainable Development Goals. And I would like to see an approach where we effectively look at the future that we want, and then we ask how we get there, and we look at the challenges and the scale and the direction of change that we need to apply, and then we will start to recognise the transformational changes, and we will see them in the system context in which they'll occur.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Okay, so David has some slides, so could we have the slides up? Hopefully there will be some slides.
Where is it?
Okay, right.
Okay.
Next bee in the bonnet is yellow. I like this.
My motto is be as radical as reality itself. I'm a 1960s radical, so take the meaning that way. And I hope to inject political economy in this presentation. I think it's been largely absent so far. By the way, I'm a minister of global biogeochemical cycles with Cyber Yugoslavia. So this is I think the biggest challenge we face. What is the main obstacle preventing catastrophic climate change? And I'm define it as keeping warming below or very close to 1.5 degrees centigrade. In brief, take the baby off the tank, melt the tank down, and make wind turbines, and ensure that the baby lives to the highest life expectancy possible on the planet. So what is the obstacle? I coined the term, you've heard Eisenhower called it the military-industrial complex. I've added a few things to the fossil fuel, nuclear, state terror, and surveillance complex, or the MIC, also named as the Lockean instrument of carnage, the Moloch of mass murder.
Everyone else can see as well, with the clicker.
I'm sorry, yes. I have to.
Because I want everyone to appreciate the
There we
words,
go.
right?
Okay, thank you. I have to do both. This, of course, is from William Blake after John Milton. Moloch. You can read the top. I'm going to skip over the top, but parents' tears. This is a more modern version. The zombie rampaging over the planet. And destroying both humans and nature. So we are now living, I prefer the term the Capitalocene rather than the Anthropocene. So I would say that humanity faces this challenge. Can the monstrous boulder of militarized fossil capital be pushed down the slope to its well-deserved sedimentary cemetery of prehistory on a path that minimizes the destruction of nature and humans? So, in our book, my book with my oldest son, Peter, we argue that preventing climate catastrophe requires global demilitarization, solarization of energy supplies, and agroecologies replacing industrial and GMO agriculture. And this, in order to eliminate energy poverty and have the capacity to confront the inevitable climate adaptation and mitigation, negative carbon emissions technology, we need more energy than now, of course, in the form of clean energy, at least probably 20 trillion watt equivalent. And the renewable sources I've listed, I think it's well known, those three. So meeting this goal requires organizing, not simply a voice of scientists and activists, but organizing a transnational movement, of course rooted in national movements and local movements, that is strong enough to defeat the imperial agenda of the militarized fossil capital, dissolve the MIC, and implement an eco-socialist global Green New Deal, thereby opening up a post-capitalist path to the solar commune scene. Now, what does that mean?
Means you win at Scrabble.
And how am I doing on time? Very good. Okay, then this is the solar commune scene. It's a socially governed global civilization realizing in the 21st century Marx's vision of communism from each according to her ability to each according to her needs, where her refers to both humans and nature. And only that nuclear reactor 93 million miles away can make this possible. That was my question to the Lovelock interview. I would point out that both Tim Lenton and James Lovelock support nuclear power, but Tim and myself prefer to be 93 million miles away. The fusion reactor of the sun. So I'll close with my book, and I have copies of my book, 20 pounds, that's cost.
Go on, move the slide on so everyone can see the cover. Do your advertising properly.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes. There's the, and that's in my poster 29. And the last slide is what I started with. Radish and radical have the same root. Be as radical as reality itself. Be red and green. Thank you. And I hope I kept the time.
I have to say, some of that in the middle sounded slightly like we were going down the plot of Star Wars, which I'm not necessarily opposed to. Okay, right, John.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm going to start with a thank you. And the thank you is to Tim Lenton. And it's by way of setting the context for what I'm then about to say. This has been one of the most extraordinary events I've been for a very long time, and I've really, really enjoyed it. When I first bumped into a very old friend here, Tim O'Riordan, who I've known since the early 1980s, his first question to me was, what the fuck are you doing here? He didn't have the F word, but he basically wanted to know what somebody like me was doing here. Let me just try and explain why he would ask that question and what my answer would be, and why it's relevant, I think, to the Gaia industry, the Gaia movement, whatever we call it. Tim would know that I have a 42-year-old daughter called Gaia. I blame Jim Lovelock for that. He's been a very big influence on my life and work, but the bulk of that work has been with business and with financial markets. I never talk about Gaia in boardrooms of the major companies that I deal with, but I do talk about Jim Lovelock. And I talk to him because of his electron capture detector. I talk to him because he blew up the chemical industry, not once with synthetic insecticides, but also with CFCs. So he is a phenomenon in the landscape that business appreciates. And if you look at his own career, he, as he said, consulted with DuPont, with ICI, both companies that were very actively involved in the CFC issue, and with Shell. And my silence, except for the question that I asked for Susan this morning, over the last 3 days, denotes no lack of interest in what's being said. In fact, I think the presentations have been quite extraordinary, enriching in many different dimensions. The silence came from the fact that I was listening. And I was listening with the ear of business, trying to think about how much of this would play in the sorts of boardrooms where we typically do most of our work. And the answer is, and with the greatest of respect, very, very little indeed. And I was saying to Chris Rapley over breakfast this morning, what he does would, and he's working with business. Tim Smith, I should declare an interest. He's been a member of our advisory board for 11 years, but he is a monster unchained at times. But business would be interested in what he has to say, not least because he's created something that has put a £1.5 billion injection into the regional economy and attracts millions of people. That resonates with people in the business world. In April, I did something clinically insane. I wrote a letter to the Times in support of Extinction Rebellion, and I got 23 CEOs of companies to sign it. And I really did think that the result of that would be a lot of our corporate clients rejecting us. I had 2 letters from CEOs saying, "What are you doing, going political? Why can't you just wait for our innovations to roll out of the gates of our R&D labs?" But a number of them also said, "Can we invite these people in? Can we talk to these particularly younger people?" And we've had companies from Finland, from Spain, from Japan, from this country getting in touch and saying, "Come and talk to our boards about this." So something is changing. And my final point is, I think there is a very real opportunity to use the Gaia 2.0 process as an open invitation to the wider world to get in. And sometimes when you invite people in, they start to pay attention in a very different way. One final example. 25 years ago, I came up with something called the triple bottom line, people, planet, profit. In June of last year, I did the first ever product recall on a management concept. Harvard Business Review, who published the piece, told me that. And the idea was not to kill that idea, but to invite other people in to reinvent it. And I wonder whether there isn't an opportunity here to invite the wider world, not just the people who come here and watch online, but into the process of thinking genuinely, what does Gaia mean for all of us? Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to start with the question of motivation, and I don't mean motivation for people in this room. I think that if you want to do anything, you have to motivate the people who, by definition, are not in the room, right? Because you're a self-selecting sample. And as an example, there's something which is very obvious to me as someone who works on ocean and atmosphere, is that most scientists of my generation and younger have not only not heard of Gaia, but they take interconnected systems completely for granted. They don't even question it. That's just it's obviously the way it works. Now, they have things to learn about how to work with complex systems, but they're convinced of the concept without knowing this label for it. So I'm interested in Gaia as motivation in itself in the way John described. But I'm also interested, and I'd like the opinions of all of the panel on this, on when you're motivating people, the thing people like most is that they do a thing and the reward comes straight away, right? They press the lever and the hamster food, oh no, hamsters haven't done well this week, have they? Anyway, guinea pig food comes out of a thing somewhere else, right? It's instant. And I think one of the problems here is that motivation is firstly, that the reward is first of all not necessarily local, because you might do good things to your river and it's the people downstream who benefit. And secondly, it can be a very long time before anything takes effect. So I would like the opinions of the panel on how we motivate, bearing those things in mind, and who we motivate, who we need to motivate. Who'd like to go first? Go on, David. No? Yeah.
May I
start?
Go on, Jane. I think this is probably one of the biggest questions that we all have to face as scientists. When I say scientists, including social scientists, academics from a range of backgrounds. We've spent our whole lives thinking that facts will change people, and we're slowly starting to realise that that's not the case, and we don't know why. And I'm no expert in this, but we've all noticed that that's the big growth area now, and the area of understanding now is probably rooted in psychology, is probably rooted in marketing. How do I go about it? Because I'm still new to this area of behaviour change. It's through talking to people in ways which interest them. So luckily, one of the areas I work in currently is sustainable food. And people, if they're not interested in sustainable food in a global context, luckily the foods that are low greenhouse gas emitters and use little land are also the foods that keep you alive for longer. So sometimes it's appealing to what motivates people. I don't know the answers about how we're going to appeal on those global challenges that aren't going to impact them directly or aren't going to impact those people 10 years from now. And I think that's an area that we all need to focus on.
Okay, right, Kirsty, motivation.
Yeah, so I think it comes back to what I was saying. Well, I think as climate scientists, historically, we've kind of broadcast about how bad the climate is, how serious it is, to help people understand the seriousness of the challenge we're facing. But I think it hasn't traditionally motivated people. It's just scared people. It puts people off. I really do think a much better way is to think about the future that you want, is to inspire people to hope, really. So instead of describing all of the problems and all of the bad things that could happen, we describe the world that we want, and then we describe the challenges of how we get there. And so you're motivating people to actually focus on being aspirational. And yes, it is different people, it is further into the future, but I think if we describe a world without hunger, without poverty, we describe a world of equity, then I think people will be inspired by that. And I think we should be telling everyone about that, because it's about that political change, grassroots. If we as a collectively want that, then we will be able to achieve it.
David?
Well, I don't think the youth of the world need motivation. They're self-motivating now. This movement is growing around the world on climate change, and of course that incorporates a lot of related issues, system change as well. I had an interesting experience at July 4th going down to the mall, and I was with the Code Pink Baby Trump contingent. But Trump supporters walked by, and I engaged in conversation with them, and particularly with some teenagers. And the first thing is respect who you're talking to. Show respect, even if you disagree, show respect. And then you can engage in a dialogue, and they will start to question some of their assumptions. And these three teenagers really, I think, they didn't know anything about climate change. And they were starting really curious. The mother of one pointed to me and said, "Don't talk to him." And her son said, "No, I want to." So that's a beginning, at least in the United States. But of course, the consciousness about climate change is really growing, that it is anthropogenic. And I think that I'm an optimist in terms of reaching the political tipping points that we need to reach to, I don't know if it's 18 months, but I think we'll get there.
Okay, John.
I wasn't the sort. Oh, does this work? Yes. I wasn't the sort of child that would take an apple to my favorite teacher, but I'm going to say something about Helen, and I apologize for it in advance. One of the things that I've learned in working with business for a very long time is that incentives are absolutely critical in that world. And so I could talk about that until the cows come home, but I'm not going to. Instead, I'm going to say the really critical thing is understanding. And David's just talked about those young Trump supporters who didn't understand climate change and its origins and its implications. The reason I mentioned Helen is that I think that science on television is one of the most critical ways to get through the background capacity to understand some of the stuff that's been discussed here today. So what she's done, what you've done, what people like Jim Al-Khalili, Brian Cox, David Attenborough, and so on done, is absolutely crucial in all of this. And I think it's one of those things that we've really got to invest much more effort in. So understanding is absolutely crucial. And I say that as somebody who gave up science at 14 and came back to it much later. And I would put Fred Pearson, Oliver Morton, and people like that in the room in that category too. Really, really brilliant at communicating what we really need to understand around science.
Well, thank you. Harry, have you got an opinion on motivation? No. Different audience.
No, I mean, I think all of these things are important, and the real challenge is the hard to reach. You know, the people who want to watch science programs, who enjoy it, yes, but our challenge is how we get through, how we create major cultural change. And I have no answer to that. But what I know is that it's a process, it's a journey. You start, and each little bit you chip away at it is important. So it is starting to understand and the importance of social science in all of this is cannot be underestimated. The understanding why it is people don't watch the programs on science, why it is that people don't want to change their behaviour. And a lot of those are obvious things. You know, you're probably happier sitting in front of the television drinking beer, and you know, and your gas guzzling machine is probably easier to not to change or whatever. But it is working out. It is the taking the first step that is what leads to the answers.
So what you both said made me think of the deficit model, which is a sort of way of thinking that says, well, just telling people information isn't going to necessarily change their minds, because they probably know enough already. They've made up their mind. What you need to look at is values. And so I want to ask, the next question is about, there's this really interesting problem, I think, that we all face with this, is that certainly my view of the way I think about Earth system science is that an individual requires humility. We've heard about the need to listen to people, to listen before speaking, which is generally a good thing in life, to respect other people's views and other people's expertise, and to take that on board. So that's great, and that's the way I try to live. And then we're dealing with this thing where one of the reasons Gaia was such a sticky concept in a lot of ways was that it was a fabulous brand, right? It's a very, even though no one can define what it is, which is fascinating, but you have this sort of name, you can give it a character, and you can talk about a thing, you've given it a brand, right? And there's a way, and the way you make noise in a complex world is you make simple statements. And you say you sound confident. We heard about the problem of conveying probabilities, right? How do you convey that you do know something? You just don't know which probability space you're going to fall into. So in order to be heard, the traditional view is to make clear statements that are understood and that are relatively simple, at least in outline. So you have to mash these two things together, right? You've got a great brand, if that's what you're into, but you have to share it with humility. And so I'm interested in how, I'm going to pick on David here, because you were talking about demilitarizing and zombies and the global revolution. It's always a good mixture of things. But in order to have that kind of change, you'd better have some pretty good branding on your side, right? How are you going to sell this idea that you're not telling people what to do, but you are telling them what to do, and they should all do what you think, but they're all individuals and they should all think it out for themselves? How are you going to deal with that?
The Green New Deal. Let me elaborate on that. Actually, a recent poll in the U.S. put it over 60% approval. A 60% want a Green New Deal.
You just want to explain briefly what it is for those who...
Yeah, well, it's it actually was a concept. The UN put out a report on it, and then one of Green Party of the United States candidates for the Senate, Howie Hawkins, put it out when he ran in 2010, and then Jill Stein ran for president twice, put it out. The eco-socialist Green New Deal includes demilitarization, but the resolution that was introduced by AOC in Congress and so on outlines an economic transformation which employs millions of workers in building renewable, repairing infrastructure. And so it's an alternative economic development plan that addresses the insecurity of employment and addresses at the same time the climate challenge and other environmental challenges. So why I think this is a program to advocate this and win a movement to it, political movement to it, I think will allow people to have an experience in reality of what it means to make this transformation. People learn by experience. All of the propaganda we share and great ideas is necessary but not sufficient. People have to be involved in mass movements in political struggle in order to change the world. So that's my short answer.
Okay, anyone else? Go on, Harry.
I was just going to say, one of the real powers of the word Gaia is it is about myth. And people forget, of course, Gaia was the mother of the Titans, the Furies, the Cyclops, the gods. She was a terrible character, actually. I mean, she had a terrible time and thoroughly incestuous. And it was a very challenging thing. But myth is really important. Myth is incredibly powerful. Story is incredibly powerful to all of us, companies, everybody. And actually, it was great that we had a discussion of history, because history is the myth that we tell ourselves. And the history that we need to be telling ourselves now is the myth that we have, and we would say it's true, history is, of course, true, but it is the story of how we have destroyed our planet and how we are going to rebuild it. And so the sense of identity that we offer people inside that rebuilding is really powerful, and the need to empower people and how you fit them in together is powerful. So we're all creating that myth of an achievable future, and we have to do it. And the history shows, which is also very good, is that people are actually happier and better when they're fighting a war. Strangely, mental health improved in the world wars, and that sense of something to fight against, something to do, is very empowering for all of us.
Well, that's why I think the Star Wars thing is interesting, because it did look a lot like that along the way in David's slides. And, maybe we just need to, put someone up to be Darth Vader once in a while. And then, we'll carry on. Okay, so Jane and Kirsty, have you got any comments on sort of the humility versus having strong ideas you want to propagate? How do you deal with that? Or anything else to do with that?
Ideally, you would paint a picture of what the better world looks like, a more sustainable world where we're happier and healthier. And that is what we've been trying to do. I'm afraid that history has overtaken us, and the speed of science is such that we don't have that luxury anymore. I think that it might be a combination now of civil uprising, big movements like we saw the women's vote, civil rights in America. They brought about sudden social changes because many people protested. It may be that Extinction Rebellion can do something like that. I think it's two prongs. There's that, and there's the direct pressure on governments from knowledgeable people like ourselves who are paid to think, bringing about legislative change. Because there's nothing changes as quickly if you can change a law. That will change the way people live like that. So I think ideally we'll do the nice stuff, civil uprising and legal changes.
The revolution starts here, people. Kirsty or John, have you got any opinions on any of that? John, you must have something to say about the value of brand. I mean, you started all this, right? Talking about companies and wanting a clear idea.
When you can pick up the right... some of you know in 1988 I did a book called The Green Consumer Guide. It sold 1 million copies in 18 months. The reason was the brand was appealing to people. People wanted to be a green, but they wanted to be consumers. So I think Gaia has this sort of mystery and murky depths to it. So I wouldn't discourage people continuing to use it, but I think it's got to be opened out in different ways. And one of the things that really struck me, I love the presentations this morning on plastics, on the financial system and so on. But when you look at where our whole world, our movement is focused largely, it's on the older, pretty tired industries, because they're the ones with the big footprints. They're the ones, whether the military industrial complex, they're the ones who are largely destroying the world. So that's where we pay attention. The problem is that the new economy is coming together at an absolute warp speed with artificial intelligence and synthetic biology and autonomous this, that, and the other, and internet of this, everything, and so on. The question, how many of us are working with those people? And when I go to see people like DeepMind here in the UK, or I go and see people in Silicon Valley, I ask them that question, who are you seeing from the sustainability industry? The answer is almost nobody. And that's a real problem. We really have to get out there and engage those people as they start to code the new economy. And part of that, maybe we'll come on to it later, is economics, because that's the master discipline. That's the operating system of our economies. And by God, that's screwed at the moment. There's some good people doing good work, but...
So we need a doctor for economics as well as for the climate. Okay, let's move on to just thinking about the research thing, because, many of the people in this room are researchers of various types, and research is in the business of finding things out. So what do we need to find out? Or do we know enough? And now we just need to go and protest on the streets and poke sticks and walk into boardrooms? Or do we need to know more? Where would your priorities for what we need to know? Or do we know enough and we just need to get on with it? Go on.
I think we do know enough, but further R&D will certainly help, and that's one of the reasons I'm an optimist. By the way, I do see a very critical role of green capital, which John represents, and that is in a coalition for a global Green New Deal. We have to start under capitalism to eventually end the rule of capital on the planet. You may not like that, but that's my perspective as an eco-socialist. And that requires utilizing divisions between capital. You have a neo-fascist militarized fossil capital, which actually is transnational. Read William Robinson's new book, Into the Tempest. And then you have green capital, and we have to use a broad coalition, but I would say, in terms of research, the R&D for renewable energy, I think it's going to give us even more efficient solar technologies, which will encourage decentralized community control and thereby undermine the legitimacy of the military-industrial complex. Because what is it needed for? To protect the oil supplies? Or protect strategic metals? What is the legitimacy? And I think that, I'm not advocating a technocratic solution. I'm saying that these developments will encourage a stronger transnational political movement that can overcome and dissolve militarized fossil capital.
Harry.
No.
Go on.
I mean, yes, of course, we know quite a lot, and we probably know enough. I think the first thing I would say about research is that far from the research being the only output of research, what the product of researchers are people who've actually read the papers. So if you stop researching, you very, very quickly forget what you know. And so that is absolutely fundamental in retaining research. The second thing is, which is rather terrifying, is there are more scientists alive today than have ever lived. So the quantity of information being produced is absolutely enormous. But one of the sad things, I think, for me, is that much of that research has tended to go in fashionable directions. And some of what we are losing are the practical research that we need in order to face the challenges. We are tragically short of plant pathologists. We're tragically short of all kinds of detailed expertise that we need to take on the challenges ahead of us. And the attractiveness has been moving into these rather sort of sexy ologies and sort of big systems approaches has really been at the expense of some quite detailed understanding of the planet. And I think there is a need to restructure and redirection part of the research effort.
Kirsty, you were talking about research before.
Yeah, so I think it's true that we know enough to know that we need to take radical action. So I don't think we need more climate science to tell us that we have a climate crisis. But I do think we need a lot more science to understand what that actually means. We have a lot of facts about the climate, but we don't really have a lot of knowledge about how we live in that future world. So I think we need a lot more research where we reach out across disciplines, and we need a lot more of an ability to speak outside of those silos. And some of that is the humility you were talking about, to say that, it's not climate science and then it goes forward. I mean, having more humility to understand, to respect the complexity of the social aspects of the economics, and allow all those different disciplines to speak together. And I think it's extremely hard to do that, to respect each other's expertise and to bring that into a shared understanding of the world. I think we need to understand how these complex social environment systems operate, and really to be able to understand how radically different the future will be from the present. Where are some of those big tipping points where there's emerging properties of a future world?
Yeah, and I might just add to that my view on that, a lot of that research is one thing people miss out is that collaborative research is expensive just because it takes time to put people in rooms to talk to each other when they're not reading papers and actually doing experiments. And that gets left out.
Sorry, I meant to, actually, we talk about that detail. I think the other thing that's really hard is how do we address those scale differences? So those very small details of systems can turn out to be really important in the future. So again, having that humility to look at even the tiniest, worms in the soil and the large climate models, and how do we integrate that all together?
John.
Fascinating. I mean, in many ways, Jim Lovelock has sketched what's coming next in Novacene. And one of the things I think we've got to do an immense amount of research on is the unintended consequences of the new economy that we're beginning to construct. And the second question that I often ask people at the cutting edge of technology as I travel around the world is, have they ever heard of Thomas Midgley Jr.? Now, a few people in the room probably have by now, but the answer is, so far, only one person, the chief software architect at Hewlett-Packard, had heard of him. The reason why I asked the question is Tom Midgley, in the 1920s and 1930s, brilliant man, had over 100 patents to his name, and I tell three nano stories about him. Firstly, he came up with leaded gasoline, brilliant breakthrough anti-knock technology, poisoned the nervous systems of millions of young people around the world. Second, he came up with freons, class of chlorofluorocarbons, helped blow the stratospheric ozone hole over Antarctica. He's been described as the single organism in Earth's history that has done most damage to the planet, and yet we haven't heard of him. And then he contracted polio, very sadly, in the early 1940s. He built himself a semi-robotic bed, and it strangled him. And I just tell those stories to say that however brilliant we may be, unintended consequences are lurking, and we really have to focus in on that now.
So we get the robots in to strangle the people who have killed the other people. Okay.
That's not quite the intention.
Jane, have you got anything to add on research?
I think there's just one other angle, really, is that I think we do know a lot, and we don't know what we don't yet know, obviously, so some research will need to continue. But I think we underestimate what's known, what we might call traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge that's held more within sort of indigenous people who understand Gaia in a way maybe that we do not. And I think for those of us in the West, we've been very slow to draw on that sort of international pool of knowledge.
Okay, so it's time to open it up to the floor. If you have a question, short questions are great. Keep your questions short and your comments shorter is what I would recommend. Right, who have we got? So up there somewhere, I can see a hand. Yes.
Unfortunately, my question isn't as short as you might prefer, but I think the panel is uniquely equipped to navigate it. So there have been many references to the royal we of humanity throughout this conference, but this conflation misrepresents an imperative layer in moving toward Gaia 2.0, which encompasses by what means Gaia has been impacted, by whose hands and at whose cost. And to draw on the astuteness of Donna Haraway's discussion of the Plantationocene, the Anthropocene is considered a species act as opposed to a historical situated set of conjunctures that are absolutely not a species act. And so, for the sake of inspiring more reflection and action to be directed at root causes and problematic axioms that have led to our global predicaments and are likely to perpetuate them if not addressed, and recognizing too that the whole human species is impacted, but the whole human species is not the cause, I ask how we can better ensure that the reference to we when discussing the Anthropocene, which is oftentimes not about humanity in general, is consistently clarified to mean specific forces of industrialization motivated by the goals of extractive capitalism to maximize shareholder value.
Okay, how do we deal with we? Who's going to go first? Yeah?
Well, the thing I really liked about that question, and I hope I understood it, is that when trying to raise my children, there was a distinct trying to divide the wrongness of the act from the naughtiness of the child. To try to present to the child as being inherently bad is, of course, terrible, but the act itself was catastrophic. And I think we do need to understand that. I mean, I think it's very important that when we talk about people, and I would hate, we're all different. We're not, this great sort of idea that we're one blob, we're all individuals within humanity, that, we're all trying, we're all doing our best. The chaos we've wreaked on the world is part of an unintended consequence that we really do need to take a grip of now.
Anyone else? How do we deal with this fact that it's not always clear who caused things and who is causing things, but we might need to separate that out somewhere. Anyone else?
I'm not sure I understood the question precisely, but I would say the we is something that is going to unfold as a global subject. And that's rooted in people that work. It's rooted in the great majority of humanity. That's who the we is. I did a book with my oldest son. We put this out. We don't pretend to know how much energy the world needs or prescribe it, but we're throwing it out for discussion and consideration. But it's going to be a process of the strengthening of let's say the emergence of a global subject, as I argued in my little PowerPoint, of sufficient strength to make Gaia 2.0 the other world that is still possible.
Any more on the we?
I think we should be extremely careful about using that word we, but my own ambition would be to have it evolve to the point where we could sensibly and legitimately use it to cover every generation of humans, past, present, and future. And the reason I say that is that I think we're headed in the next 15 to 20 years into a period where the crisis builds, and it builds quite rapidly, and ahead of the political capacity to respond. And I think what we will see there is something we began to see in the 1960s, which is intergenerational conflict on a scale that we really haven't experienced for a very long time. And it will be driven by the economy moving to Asia. It'll be driven by loss of employment to artificial intelligence. It'll be driven by lots of different things. So the populism that we see with Trump and others, I think, is just the precursor of a set of intergenerational conflicts and tensions which we've got to step into and head off. And it would be very easy just to say, I was at an event the other day where they said, let's get rid of everyone over 50. They didn't mean kill them. They just meant, let's get them out of the process, as they did after the apartheid regime came down in South Africa. I don't think that's the answer, because if you look at the over 50s, they're now the people, largely with the wealth, with the connections, and with the political, they're the people who vote. So we've really got to build these bridges across all generations, not just to the young, although they're critically important too.
There's clearly a vocabulary problem. If you can say the sentence, we shouldn't say we. There's clearly something going on. Okay, right. Someone on this side, halfway up there, the white T-shirt.
Hi. You've talked about motivation, and to me there's one method which you haven't mentioned. And Jane's talked about the knowledge of indigenous tribes and that kind of area. And there was a question about it yesterday which drew laughter from the audience, which I found kind of sad and frustrating. And I'm talking about the use of transcendental experiences with psychedelics. Every society, bar the West in the last few hundred years, has used psychedelics and transcendence and held these experiences in high esteem. How do you think that this can be used as a tool to kind of combine with the environmental movement?
Views on psychedelics.
I'm happy to have a go.
Go on then.
I was given LSD in 1969. It lasted 4 years, so I'm not recommending it, but actually it opened all sorts of perceptual windows. So I think it should be one of the options to explore, but within a social context, which is really much more supportive than most people are in when they take these sorts of compounds.
Anyone else?
That's killed it.
No, go on. I was going to have a go.
I don't think I can really say anything about psychedelics, but I suppose I take the point that we need to really open our horizons and think much more widely outside of our own perceptions and our disciplines, and we should be open to embracing other perspectives.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back to this side. Just behind you on what's my left, your right.
Thanks. I wanted to come back to Kirsty's point about the modelling community was sort of sucked into this, I want more detail. And in my experience, when people in my career asked for more detail, usually they wanted more clarity, not more detail. But it does seem to me you were sucked into a trap by the anti-global warming people. How do you think you should get out of it, and what lessons does that have for the future?
Distinction between clarity and detail, yeah.
So I think it's really engaging with what the bigger question is. So as climate scientists, we might ask questions about climate variables like temperature and precipitation, and then putting some values on those in the future, say with some error bars and some uncertainty. But quite often I've found when I've been working with people who've been trying to make adaptation decisions and they ask for some climate plots and I produce them, and then I see what they do with them, I say, if I'd known that was what you're doing, I wouldn't have given you that information, because there's actually an awful lot of decisions made by climate scientists. You know, you've got these terabytes and terabytes of data, you have to chop it up, you have to process it, you have to average it in some way. And a lot of climate scientists' values or assumptions about what other people are going to do are in those. I think the only way to, and we reduce a lot of the uncertainty because people don't understand it, and then we lose some of the complexity or the information in our climate projections. I think the only way is to work very closely with, I say users, but they're not providers and users, but they're everyone kind of involved in understanding the problem, and think about what their bigger question is. If the bigger question is, how do we feed 9 billion people on the planet, knowing that the climate is changing and everything else is changing, then we should be looking at that bigger question and then going back and saying, well, what do we need to know from the climate science to answer that question? Not tell me about the future climate and I will work at the so what from there.
Anyone else? And also the problems, we haven't talked about big data at all, but when it comes to giving everyone access to data, that also opens up potential for cherry picking and who has judgment to choose which data we get used. I mean, this is a minefield, right? Go on, Harry.
No, and I just think it is important to continue the modelling game. I think it's a shame to, as the computers get bigger and the languages change, you do need a whole new generation of modelers getting things more accurate, looking at the uncertainties, adding water vapour and clouds into the models that were simplified out of the systems early on. And so I think it is a process that we need to continue. I think, you know, what it throws up, I'm not sure, but I think would be useful.
Just because I'm not advocating we do less modelling or that we don't model, I just think that we integrate that knowledge better in the wider system, yeah.
Okay, on that side, just behind you, back a bit. Can't see who it is. Oh, yeah, right.
Hi. I am a little bit from a different field because I am a planetary geologist and I study places where asteroids are just smashing into Earth. And a couple of years, well, many years ago, our community had a similar problem to the problem that we are facing right now with the climate change, meaning that no one wanted to hear us, that it's an actual problem and we should do something about that. What helped was involving Hollywood. Armageddon movie really was a game changer for us. And based on, like, afterwards, it was really easy to convince policy makers and, people with money that we need a lot of planetary protection systems. So maybe you could suggest a good, engaging, and scientific movie scenario that we should, create to have something about climate change.
That's a question to go to the bar after the party. That's when you get good answers to that. But let's see what our panel could come up with. Movie plot. Pitch your movie plots. Go on.
I posed this to the workshop yesterday. It's a very practical question. How can we pass the credentials committee of the Galactic Club? That's the advanced civilizations that Ronald Wells' book named, and Sagan and Newman back in the 80s argued there was a filter where primitive civilizations like our own, would anyone deny that we're a primitive civilization? with the turmoil and war and poverty that exists in the world. I hope no one denies that. But so how do we advance to a mature civilization? I think this is, whether a galactic club exists or not, to figure that out. And I think this is really the theme of this panel, is how do we advance to a better world? That's Gaia 2.0. So that's a suggestion for a movie.
I love that, 'cause I heard
I hope
this-
it culminates with us actually joining the Galactic Club.
I heard a suggestion the other day, and working on something a week ago about aliens, that the reason that we haven't discovered alien life is because it's put a sort of hologram around us, and it's waiting to see whether we destroy ourselves. And if we don't, they will lift the veil and show us the rest of the universe. So we're on probation, basically. That's brilliant.
Right,
okay.
right.
Any Hollywood producers in the room? Any more suggestions before we move on?
Just a very quick one. I mean, I'm nervous about billionaires, but a number of them have come into this space, and one of them, Jeff Skoll, set up participant productions specifically to underwrite films that had a social or environmental or sustainability message. So I'm not sure how much impact that's actually had. So maybe if James Cameron suddenly waded in and did an Avatar 7 on Gaia, it might help a bit. But we should keep the invitations going out to these people.
What have they funded already, these people? Have they funded anything yet?
Oh, yeah, no, they've funded about 50 or 60 films. And some of them had, the original idea was that you'd fund a film, it would release, and alongside that you'd put in place a campaign to build the political impact and so on. How well it's done overall, I'm not sure, but it's been running for now for about 10 to 15 years.
Okay, we've had lots of hands down here. Maybe over there, and then we've got another one. Where's my other microphone? Down here, yes, second row.
Well, when you explain that we need to see the future we want and see how we get there, or when I hear that, I mean, so David Schwartzman proposing a eco-socialism that would be a 21st century version of Marxism. Doesn't it sound like planned economy? And can't we remember that the previous versions of the planned economy, the previous implementations, have been suppressing individual freedom and creativity? Isn't there a risk here?
I think I heard what that question was. Let me say that the socialism, real existing socialism of the 20th century grew on very adverse circumstances. And it was a mixture of great achievements and terrible crimes. And the two coexisted. We need to learn from that experience, and this is not a reason to throw out the baby with the bathwater. The baby is the vision of a socially managed, democratic global society that is not ruled, that is not governed by an elite who wants to reproduce capital to earn profit. That's the vision which I think is the challenge for this century. But getting there requires a bottom-up movement which, by its very nature, will maximize the democratic and social participation of a future society. So that's my short answer to that challenge, which I think is very, very relevant.
Harry, did you say something? Yeah.
The answer is yes. I mean, I'm listening to John's comments about the next 20 years and his concerns. I would echo those. I mean, democracy is precious and it is fragile. And it is disappearing in quite a few parts of the world. And this is a really major issue because democracy has been a significant driver of progress and the way we think. And democracy is also destroyed internally within democracy. So we have been ruled in this country, and this is a slightly prejudicial view on my part, but is evidenced by recent events, by small cliques and cabals of people that control the selection of candidates for an electoral system. So what we are faced with, actually, are some quite fundamental questions about democracy itself if we are going to create a future democratic system. So I agree with you.
Okay, we had a question here, yeah.
Tim, Reid and Helen, you've done a wonderful job and it's a wonderful panel. As this conference is coming to an end, there's a distant rumble on the horizon, and it's September the 20th, when the next great combination of the Extinction Revolution and the Students' Rebellion will make itself thoroughly recognized. Now, that is democracy of a kind we've never had before.
Do you just want to describe what's going to happen?
So what I'm driving at is two things. One is, can we make sure that Gaia is understood in this process? I'm not convinced that Gaia as a concept is fully understood. And I think it would be rather helpful if people like James and others ask the students, what kind of words would you use in relation to Gaia that it's actually got a greater public friendliness? The one which I find least public friendly is Gaia 2.0. What does that actually mean to anyone? It's not a phraseology that beckons people. So I've got three comments for you very quickly. One is, think about getting Gaia into a language that people can cope with, regeneration, revitalization, or something. Secondly, make sure that it ties in with what these young people are saying, because they're talking that language. And thirdly, as David has been saying, out there is a thing called the Green New Deal. You know, we make it work and not have it politicized as it is right now, it becomes the next stage of the Gaian revolution.
Comments on that from the panel? And there's interesting here about how much you follow and how much you lead. I mean, that's part of it.
It's also more of it's a powerful statement, and I think it has to be true, is that the language of one generation tends not to be the language of the next. And so, so we do need to listen very, very carefully to what's coming out of, say, Extinction Rebellion, which is a many-headed hydra. It's very difficult because it is a totally dispersed, devolved system to have a conversation with Extinction Rebellion. It has no narrow leadership. I keep trying to engage with it, but it's quite challenging. But I totally agree that the need to engage with another generation requires the understanding of their requirements for language, not the imposition of our own views.
One very more quick question. I've got another question for the panel. Over there, yes.
Hello. I don't know if I'm the only person in the room that can relate to Greta Thunberg's idea of feeling very like we're all having an existentialist crisis. And the reason I feel that way is because I feel that by existing, I'm actually contributing to the problem. And I don't know if anybody else understands what I mean by that. But living in the society that I live in, I consume plastics, I wear clothes, I'm producing microfibers into, I heat my house, I have a job, I have enormous carbon footprint living in a high-income country. So I can totally relate to what she said. And I also wonder, I guess my question is why nobody on the panel has really mentioned population growth as an issue and whether that's something that we should address on a global scale.
Okay, existential angst and population growth. David?
I think the world is overpopulated with billionaires. Population is certainly an issue. There's a long tradition of Malthusianism, and I think the ruling classes of the world prefer to see a biological explanation for our crisis, that is multiplication of human population. That takes the heat off the political economy. If we look at countries that have stabilized their population, or states in countries like Kerala, India, we see that women's empowerment and equality plays a huge role. And that's when people take birth control seriously and they limit their population. The extrapolations of the UN to 11 billion by the end of the century, I think, are ludicrous, because either we'll succeed in preventing the worst climate catastrophe by system change, and if, in that case, will lead to a stable population, probably around 9 billion. Or if we fail, mass epidemics and starvation resulting from climate catastrophe will also likely plunge the population down. So that's my take on the population issue. But as far as existential urgency, I fully share that view, but it shouldn't lead us to defeatism. It should empower us to go beyond our simple lifestyle. And I concede, you know, I took a plane here, I didn't row, but we need to go beyond our lifestyle, as important as that is, and engage in collective action, in mass movements. That's what's going to change society, not simply individual decisions on our lifestyle. But I'm not disregarding the importance of the lifestyle issue, because, again, you're looked as a hypocrite. I guess I am a hypocrite for flying here.
Okay, so to finish off, I just want one comment from the panel on one thing. I think there's a difference between the ideal world you can paint, which would be very nice if you could switch the world off, reboot the software and start again, and the place you can get from where you actually start from, which is here. And so in 1986, Arthur C. Clarke wrote a book that was called The 20th of July, 2019, 50 years on from the moon landings, and in it he looked ahead to last Saturday, or the Saturday before, and wrote about what he thought the world would be like. I highly recommend this book. But for our panellists here, I want you to speak to the people at the Gaia conference in 33 years' time. What do you think the world, just a brief comment from each of you, a brief comment on either what you would like the world to be like in 30 years' time, or what you think it will be like in 30 years' time.
Okay, so I'd like the world to be a place where we've changed the way in which we visualise how we use the land, where it may be dietary driven. So think about some of the zero carbon research that we've done. It's looking at if you change your diets, you can use a lot less land, therefore enabling more natural ecosystems to flourish, to be larger, to connected. And those are the ecosystems that carry out the ecosystem, you know, the life support systems, the Gaian processes.
So we'll keep it quick. So brilliant.
Okay, so then what it will likely be like, I suspect that in the UK we might get there with some government-led management of the landscape and some laws coming in, and we might meet our climate change targets and our IPBES targets, but I suspect that will be at the cost of other nations which we'll lean on to get our food and fuel from.
Okay, who's going next? Kirsty?
Yes, okay, so I guess my hope for the future that we have is that actually this whole climate crisis is a catalyst for addressing wider inequalities in the world, that we actually learn to value human beings. We live in a world where we produce enough food to feed 9 billion people, and yet we have hundreds of millions of people who are currently hungry, and that's not a climate crisis, that's our human system. And I'm hoping that the fact that we're forced to address these large-scale system problems because of the changes to the climate means that we will actually take this seriously, or value human beings and take these world problems seriously and think in a bigger scope. I think in truth we probably won't get there. I don't think we'll necessarily meet all the sustainable development goals, but I think at least we'll be going in that direction, and then we'll be better because we think that way.
Okay, David.
Well, I second what Kirsty just said. I would say in 30 years, we implement this imperative. Every child born on the planet has the right to the highest life expectancy possible, state of the science life expectancy, and inherits a world of biodiversity, and restoration of biodiversity. Now we're to a point we're losing it, of course. And I actually expect that to happen. Even though I wrote
optimism.
it. Yes. I expect it to happen. I'm a wishful thinker.
Okay, Harry.
I think one of the most disturbing things is it's very difficult to imagine it. I mean, I think it's. I think for me, it's it's a hotter world. I think very much looking at the landscape that Jane's talking about. That will change quite significantly from things that we really don't expect at the moment. I mean, I think some of the plant health threats that are there. I think politically, I think as John started to touch on, there are major issues, and it's almost impossible. There are tipping points that would take us either way. As an optimist, we would have a reformed, flatter society that was delivering better benefits across it, but it could equally go the other way inside this is what's happened to democracy worldwide.
And John?
I think the existential crisis that you called out is something that many of us are beginning to experience, and if we're not, we're sort of disconnected from that wider world. Many more people will experience it, and that's both exciting in terms of the political energies released, but it's actually very disturbing because when people are agitated and uncertain, they tend to go for simple solutions. They tend to go for people who profess to know what they're doing, and a lot of the political leaders at the moment don't do that. For me, I would love to say to that future world, watch today's world very carefully, because whether it's the Global Systems Institute or other institutions or organizations or networks present here or online, these solutions are beginning to evolve. We can see them increasingly. We're beginning to support them. We're going to have to do a lot more about that. And I think my final point would be, we've all got to become activists. We can no longer afford to subcontract activism to NGOs or other wonderful groups. We've got to do it ourselves and find out new ways of making change happen.
And that's a great note to finish on. Please join me in thanking our fabulous panel, Jane, Harry, Kirsty, David and John.